Welcome back to the Informed Pregnancy and Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, pregnancy-focused chiropractor Dr. Elliot Berlin. Today we continue the second part of our episode featuring Michelle Christensen, who has now welcomed her first child into the world. Last time, Michelle shared her anticipations and how her plans had significantly evolved due to circumstances out of her control. She was preparing for a breech birth. In this post-birth episode, Michelle is joined by her husband, Jason, to help tell the complete birth story. Together, they'll share insights into how their plans unfolded and the experiences they encountered along the way. Michelle and Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. We also have little Hudson here with us. So
Little Hudson was with us last time.
He was. So if you hear
in utero.
him, yes.
Yeah. Well, nice to meet you on the outside, Hudson. All right. Last time we spoke, Michelle, you were telling me that you had plans, that you're in life a more naturally focused person, in your pregnancy a more naturally focused person, and in your plans for birth a more naturally focused person, and things were just turned around as your baby was breech, which is pretty limiting if you can't encourage them to naturally turn. And here in Los Angeles, there still is the option for the idea of a vaginal breech birth, which was, going to the podcast, what you were aiming for. Well, congratulations, the baby's out. How did the rest of your pregnancy go, and how did birth begin?
Okay, I guess I'll just start from the beginning. I think I was like 38 weeks when we last talked. I can't remember, but my water broke when I was 40 and 2 days. And it's not like when you see in the movies where it like gushes out of you. It was like, and did my water break? Like, or am I just leaking maybe a little bit of pee? I don't know.
Just
It was
for
a Friday.
context, yeah, what time of day is this, and what were you doing?
So it was a Friday evening. We were gonna go get sushi, and it was like 5 p.m. and I was getting ready to leave, and I, went to the bathroom, and I was like, oh, this feels like this might be more water than urine. And I told Jason, and I texted Nina, my doula, and I was like, I think my water may have broken. She's like, oh, okay. Just go about your day, just do whatever you're doing, and we'll check in later. So just went about the rest of my night. We went to sushi, went to Sugarfish. If you live in LA, you know Sugarfish. And we ended up leaving. Jason was a little anxious that my water had, broke, and was like, we need to pack for the hospital and do all these things. And
she had told me for about a month to have a hospital bag packed and just have all my eggs in the basket, or so you would speak. And I had none of that done. So I was feeling a little anxious and going on the stuff that I was supposed to do.
And both my midwife and doula were like, no, get some food. Don't go home. But I ended up ordering sushi in, and we just came home, and we're going to play the waiting game and see what happened. And so came home, went to bed, and because I was GBS positive, like we talked about last time, can't, it's kind of like, okay, your water broke. So kind of have to start figuring out what your next steps are. So decided to wait to tell my OB the next day that my water broke, because I didn't want to feel rushed to come into the hospital. So my midwife, because she was still in the picture, even though I was having a hospital birth with an OB, ended up coming the next day to give me antibiotics because I was GBS positive. And the next day, we still kind of were playing the waiting game. Nothing was happening, no contractions. So my OB was totally fine with my midwife coming over, giving me antibiotics so we could wait a little bit longer to go to the hospital. And he said, if you're still not having contractions, come into the hospital by Saturday night, and, we'll try and get the ball rolling. Oh, did castor oil. I totally forgot about that. We did the whole castor oil smoothie, did 2 rounds of those. Nothing happened.
What's your recipe?
The recipe, okay, so the castor oil, obviously, and then it was like some kind of fruit juice, like a mango fruit juice. You made it for me. Was that it? Oh, and ice.
Peanut butter.
Peanut butter and ice.
Yeah, peanut butter and ice.
Couldn't taste it. Went down easy. And I was like, I've heard kind of horror stories that it could really get things into gear and get things going. Nothing happened. Oh yeah, pumping to try and get some contractions going. Nothing. So we headed to Cedars around, I don't know, somewhere between like 8 and 10 p.m., something like that. Still nothing was happening. Doula met us there and nothing was happening for a while. And finally, they were like, okay, let's try and get some contractions going. So we ended up going with Pitocin, which was something I did not want to do, obviously, but we wanted to try and get some contractions going. So I think we did that around maybe Saturday morning.
Yeah, early morning, like 9 or 10.
Yeah, we waited. So water broke Friday and nothing had happened up until Saturday morning. No, Sunday
Sunday
morning.
morning.
Wow, Sunday morning. So got the Pitocin going, which I was very reluctant to do, but we needed to start getting some movement going. And my OB, he was totally cool throughout this. He's like, okay, cool, play the waiting game. You know, no stress. He wasn't like trying to force me into doing anything. He was like, let's just try and get this baby out.
I got two questions. More antibiotics when you got to the hospital?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So they wanted me on antibiotics. So yeah, I just continued every 4 hours to give me antibiotics.
And did the Pitocin do anything? Did you start to feel surges?
Yes. So it kicked in pretty quickly and they're very strong. And his heart rate would drop a lot with the Pitocin. Every time they'd try and up the Pitocin, his heart rate would drop. And, you know, there were certain positions that I would get in. You know, we were doing all the things and, you know, getting in, trying to do a mile circuit, you know, where you're in the different positions to try and get things going and
At this point, no pain medication?
no pain medication.
Okay, so you got the
And
Pitocin. Yeah.
I forgot to mention there was also meconium. That was the main reason why we went to the hospital. I forgot about that.
Oh, you saw meconium in the water.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so you've got GBS plus, you've got meconium. You don't really
Yes.
have contractions, so you're kind of inducing the contractions.
Yes.
As you have contractions, it sounds like the stronger the surges are, the baby's heart rate is not tolerating them.
Dropping. Yes.
Okay.
So we were playing this like teeter totter of like going up in Pitocin, baby wasn't tolerating it well. So going back down and they're trying to get me different positions. And then the contractions got pretty strong and there was a lot of meconium coming out of me Sunday night. Yeah, by Sunday night, they were getting very strong and I was having very intense back labor, but it was high in my back. So my doula thinks that his chin was like stuck on like my like was up, like they call it stargazing, I think. So as he was coming down, it was like his chin was just scraping along my back and it was very painful. And I was really trying. The epidural wasn't even in my like mindset. Like I was so against the epidural. But I think they could tell that I was in a lot of pain. And so my doula was like, I'm just gonna mention this to you once and you know, you let me know if you want to, and if not, I'm not gonna mention it again. She's like, the epidural might be a good idea. It'll help relax things a little bit, maybe help him come down. And at this point, I'm still not progressing. I think I'm still like 1 centimeter, like nothing is happening. And she's like, you're not even in active labor yet. You know, you're obviously in a lot of pain. And I was like, no, I'm not there yet.
I have a question. Had you had a conversation with your OB, with your whole team, with yourself about what kind of things would lead you to continue to change course away from the vaginal birth, which I know is the farthest thing from what you had planned for?
I don't think I really talked about like alternatives. Like I think I was just like, we're going for the vaginal birth and this is what's happening. And I know we didn't really talk about like, okay, what if we need to go off course a little bit? So kind of was just kind of going with the flow and just letting it unfold. Yeah.
Okay, so Nina's like, let me just put out there maybe an epidural.
Yeah. Yeah. And coming from her, like in my birth plan, I was very specific. Like I do not want, you know, any pain medication, but coming from her and her bringing it up to me felt a lot better than like a nurse being like, hey, you're obviously in a lot of pain. Do you want the epidural? Like I trust her. And so for her to be like, it might be a good idea for you to get it at this point, like, you know, these are pretty strong surges and you're obviously in a lot of pain. And this might just give you a little bit of relief and allow him to, you know, start making some progress and dilating. And at first it was a hard no. And then 10 minutes later, I was like, okay, let's have this conversation. Like, what will that look like if I do get the epidural? So I ended up making the decision to get the epidural just in hopes that it would help my body relax and allow him to drop down a little bit more and give me that vaginal birth that I was hoping for. Got the epidural, which I think I hated it. I hated the feeling of like the numbness in your legs. You can't move. Like I was not a fan of the epidural, but I felt so much relief. So that was nice that that back pain was not happening anymore. And we were still playing the waiting game. So that was late Sunday night that I got the epidural.
2 in the morning.
Yeah, something like that. And at this point, we've been at the hospital since Saturday night. He's on no sleep. I barely slept. Nina's been with us there the whole time, pretty much, for my doula for like more than 24 hours. And so Brock came in. My OB kept coming and checking in with me. And, you know, totally cool as a cucumber, no stress. And he was like, okay, if we don't have a baby by Monday morning, I think, you know, we need to start talking about a C-section. And that was like my biggest fear. And I think I might have mentioned that when we talked last time, you and I, that was my biggest fear. Like, I did not want to have a C-section. But at this point, I think I was a little bit more open to it because the way things were going, I was ready to just be done and have him out of me. And I think I knew that he was under a lot of stress, the baby, and I just wanted him to still no dilation either. I think the furthest I got was 3 centimeters, and my water had been broken for 48 hours at that point. So after doing all the things, late Monday night, actually, you know, probably around 7 p.m., Brock came in and he's like, okay, they checked me 3 centimeters and they're like, okay, I think it's time for a C-section. And I was ready at that point.
We're going to take a little break, but before we do, this is something that you said in the first episode. You said in response to questions about just your plan going from home birth, peaceful, serene, surrounded by your environment, surrounded by loving, nurturing people, and, you know, your own steam, already changing to, you said, I tried everything, chiropractic adjustments, the Webster technique. You said you did spinning babies, you did the external version, and it was a tough call, but you met with an obstetrician who was experienced in vaginal bridge delivery, and that gave you some comfort. It wasn't the plan you wanted, but the safest choice for the circumstance. And then you also said, there were days I felt so frustrated and scared, like my body was somehow failing me, but I kept focusing on the end goal, which was a safe delivery for my baby, no matter how that had to happen. So definitely on some level, you were open to birth any way it needed to happen. It might have been deep in your consciousness, but it seems like, once again, just at this point of the story, and things are just unfolding, like you again gave it every possible shot. I can't really even think of anybody who would have been more open, more patient, more willing to try things to help this baby come out healthy vaginally before saying, you know what, guys, we need to consider calling this a cesarean. And it also sounds like by that point you were ready to hear it.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll
Let's
take a
take-
break and we'll continue.
We'll take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll find out what happens next. Welcome back. We are talking to Michelle and Jason and little baby Hudson, who remembers everything that happened. And at this point, you've gone to the other end of the spectrum. I always say that birth is a flowchart, the birth plan. On page 1 is the most natural birth that you kind of picture yourself wanting to have. And you go through all the different stages of, if this happens, let's go that way. If this happens, let's go that way. You sound like you're at the end of the flowchart. What happens next?
So they start prepping me for C-section, and that happens so quickly. It's like you make that decision and they're in there and they're prepping you. You got to get your stuff out of that room. We're packing. It happens very quickly. And to be completely honest, it was very emotional for me. And I think I was very strong throughout this, like making those decisions, like Pitocin, epidural was like, yes, let's just do it. Like I felt confident in those decisions. And once I got to the C-section, that was very emotional for me because that was the last thing I wanted to do. And it wasn't even the idea of getting a surgery. It was just so far from like my natural plan. And I just kind of know how it happens, the way that they pull him out and how things just flow after that. It just wasn't my ideal birth. So I was just more upset for the birth that he was having. But like you said, I had tried everything. This was the last resort. And I felt good about making the decision because I knew that I had done and tried everything and there was nothing else I could do at this point. So we went into C-section and I was very shaky. Like it happened very quickly. You know, the surgery is very quick. So much adrenaline was pumping through my body. I was very just shaky. And
What's the physical preparation for the cesarean like?
Oh gosh. Like, what did they do to me?
Yeah. And was Jason allowed to be there?
Jason was allowed to be there. He wasn't allowed to be there when they prepped me. They take me into a whole nother room. And honestly, I don't quite remember. Everything like happened so fast. They were hooking me up to things and I think pumping more epidural through my IV and, checking to make sure I can't feel down there and, asking me questions. And it's honestly kind of blurry by this point because it just happened so quickly. But Jason was allowed to be there. And
Jason was allowed to be there for all of that prep or after the prep?
after the prep. So they made
Okay.
him wait outside the room while they prepped me.
Got
I
it.
don't know if you want to share your experience.
With that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had to wait outside for probably 10, almost 15 minutes, kind of just pacing back and forth. And finally they let me in. And the way I had to walk in was I walk in where I can see the entire operating table, and they were pretty much started at that point. So I literally walked by where everything was going on. And then you just go behind a curtain and there's her head. And I kind of just lost it. It was really hard for me. And if we want to get to my emotional, my the effects this had on me, we can do that. But
I'm curious what it was that came up for you at that point.
see, I hadn't slept for probably 2 days at this point, maybe an hour or two here and there. So my emotions were high. I mean, this whole experience at the hospital was difficult for me. I was an emotional wreck, and she was actually the strong one. I lost it when she decided to do Pitocin because I knew she was not wanting to do that from the get go. I lost it when she decided to do the epidural. I couldn't be in the room, so I had to leave the room, and that was hard for me. And then I really lost it when we chose to do a C-section, and I just cried so much because, like she said, they come in, it's so quick. There's no comfort really. It's like you have a doctor come in and she starts explaining all the side effects right away. They tell you to pack up your stuff. You don't get a moment to just really
Mhm.
process it. So I just lost it, and I just went down and I hugged her and I told her how strong she was and how proud of her I was. But to the operating room, that was pretty difficult because you're just behind a curtain and she's there, and she was kind of in and out of consciousness. Like she was there, but not really at the same time. Like her eye contact was never really on me. It was just kind of in outer space. So that was, go ahead. You want to say something?
No, I was gonna say, I think that because I was so shaky, they had asked me like, "Oh, do you want something?" And I was like, "Sure," not really thinking what they were giving me. And I figured out later that I think they gave me morphine to
Uh-huh.
calm down from all the shaking. And
Sometimes they give you an anti-anxiety drug.
no, that
But
was not anti-anxiety. It
okay,
what
and they
it
also sometimes give you little amnesic drugs that make you
I don't know
and
what they gave me because I think someone had said that they saw that.
I saw a tag that said morphine on her IV,
oh, okay, so you're also getting morphine at the very
which
least.
that could have been hooked up prior. So that might not have been for your anxiety or shaking.
So the second they gave me that, it was like a switch. Like I was just so foggy and out of it. Yes, the shaking stopped. Looking back, I would have rather been shaky than how I was feeling. I was so out of it. I felt so tired. And I remember when they pulled little Hudson out, I heard him crying and I hear, Jason, oh my God, babe, he's so beautiful and all of these things. And to be completely honest, in that moment, I could care less because of how I was feeling. I was so out of it. Yes, I was so happy that my baby was out of me, but just the way that I was feeling, I was just exhausted. And the morphine just totally had me in another world. And I remember them
Whoa.
like bringing him up to me, and I was so happy. But at the same time, I was just like, I don't know. It wasn't how I pictured, like, seeing my baby for the first time.
I don't
And
want to put words in your mouth, but as a just a listener, it sounds like it was an out-of-body experience. Like, oh,
totally.
looking at yourself like, oh, this baby's on my chest. Oh, I'm
Oh,
happy.
yeah, I didn't get to get him on my chest. They brought him
Oh,
up to me and like held him up to me, and he wasn't allowed to be on my chest. And Jason, went and while they cut the umbilical cord very quickly, all the things I didn't want, wiped down all the vernix, all the things I didn't want, and all of that stuff was out of my control at that point.
okay. So you're physically numb from
Mm.
physically numbing medications. You're possibly sort of consciously numb from other medications, and everything is unfolding in all the ways that you didn't want, but we're open to if necessary for a healthy delivery. And then, Jason, if I'm hearing you right, I mean, it sounds like you both had visions and plans for how things would go and how it would be like a very conscious and bonding experience for all three of you. And obviously, each step of the way that became less of a reality. But it also, what I heard you say was that for each of those checkpoints, it was emotional for you because you knew it wasn't what Michelle wanted.
Yeah, we had taken birth classes with Nina, and we just spent so much time envisioning, and myself included. I was 100% on board with this home delivery, and I believed it every step of the way. And I had envisioned it as well, just like she did, about this beautiful, we were hoping it was just going to be her and I in the room, in a tub, wherever it may be, and just this connection that you can't describe. And that's really what I was focusing on. I had vision that it was so far from it that every little step of the way, every checkpoint, like you said, was just so emotional for me because I knew that this impacted her and her plan, which was hard for me. And then, you get to the C-section and, they pull the baby out and they pull the curtain down and they say, "Oh, take a video, take a picture." Mm-hmm. So I had my camera ready, and what you see, it's so disturbing. And it was so disturbing to me. And it was hard for me to just like be happy and be in the moment because I'm not going to go too into detail, but it's just not what you envision. It's not beautiful. And then they have me walk around to go meet the baby in the little heat incubator. And again, you walk right by the surgical table where it's just not pleasant to see. And then you go over there, and like she said, the umbilical cord's cut. I had no say in that. And so that's cut. And then your baby's sitting there, and you don't even have control, and you can't pick him up. And you're just staring at this baby while the doctors are doing all these things to him, and he's crying and screaming. And then they have me hold him and bring him back to her. And for me personally, me holding the baby while she's laying on an operating table, the furthest from her plan, and I'm trying to be happy and smile and enjoy me holding my baby for the first time, was the hardest thing probably I've ever had to do. And just seeing her and knowing that she just can't connect right now, how am I supposed to connect as a father? So I tried my best to just be happy and be in the moment, but it was very, very difficult. That moment was very hard. And we know other couples who have had C-sections, some planned and some like more planned than ours. And they were happy, they were smiling, they have videos. We were so far from their experience. And
Again, just as an observer, a couple of observations might be this was the end of a very long flow chart for you of things not going the way you wanted for, planned for, worked very, very hard for. And you're a healthy couple. Michelle, you're a healthy person with a healthy body. You take care of yourself. So each one of those was its own frustrating letdown. Your water broke like 3 days before this or something. And all the different stages that you went through there with your delicious cocktails and home antibiotics and getting to the hospital. And, just under regular circumstances, when you're getting Pitocin, you're feeling those surges and you don't have the medication and you're not progressing. And then the worry of why are the contractions making the baby's heart rate drop and how are we ever going to progress? Just the pure lack of sleep, 180 on your birth plan, sort of at the end, rush into the last straw for yourselves. You can't compare that to a C-section for someone who wants it and where everybody's well rested, had their coffee, maybe not her, but where the baby hasn't been, through this long journey with you. It's just different, You're right. How could you possibly? I don't even know how you could stand on 2 feet and hold the baby, to be honest, at that point.
Me, no.
No.
Him.
Jason. And then the other thing I just wanted to say, I mean, you said you don't want to get into too much detail when they lowered the curtain or when you walked around Michelle on what you saw, but are you just referring to looking at your wife surgically in the middle of abdominal surgery?
that too, but it was more of
Just to lighten the mood for a quick second, you should share when they took him out and like your thought because he was breathed.
well, I'll get to that next. But yeah, just the way you want to meet your baby for the first time is not through a curtain with 4, 5, 6 sets of doctor hands trying to wake your baby up in ways that you just don't understand as a parent. And it was just a shock to me what they were doing to him. It was almost like he was a human pinata of some sort, trying to wake him up. And it was very difficult. I mean, it's not how you want to see your baby for the first time. So that's what I'll say about that.
I see.
What were you saying that I should talk about?
What, because he was breathed when they took him out.
So when I first walked over to the little heater, he obviously was breached. His body was folded in half. His heels and his feet were at his ears, but they were crisscrossed. and I could see his hips and his butt, and it just looked like he was unhinged. My first thought was like, oh my gosh, my baby is paralyzed. Like, oh,
Oh my.
and my mind went there, and I asked the doctor, I was like, oh my gosh, is my baby going to be like this forever? And they laughed and were like, no, he will eventually unfold.
Yeah, but that probably lasted for a little while though, no? At least a few days.
Yeah, a few days, definitely.
Oh yeah.
Folded up in half.
I guess.
Okay, I mean, I'm breathing better knowing the baby's out. Okay. I mean, I already knew because I'm just looking at all three of you sitting there, but it was still kind of a tense moment. However, I get the sense it's not the end of the story. So let's take one more break and come back and find out what happens next. Welcome back. We're talking to Michelle, Jason, and Hudson, and the baby's out. You're exhausted in every possible way, but you're holding the baby. Jason, what happens next?
So we're holding the baby, and it's probably another half hour at least for them to stitch her back up, clean up. And I'm holding the baby the whole time, and it's nice. I mean, after a while, you're like, "Oh my gosh, this is my beautiful baby boy." You know, it's the process is over, it's done, and you can finally let your mind relax and go to the next stage of where you're about to be a new parent. So we sat there for a while, and she got stitched up, and then they rolled us into, I guess, a recovery room.
Yeah, PACU, post anesthesia.
Yeah, PACU. Yep. And a funny story, well, not funny, but through this whole process in the hospital, I would go on little walks through the hospital when she was sleeping or when I couldn't be in the room, and I'd walk by the OR room, the sign I wouldn't be in, but there's a sign that says, operating room to the right. Then it said PACU to the right. And I'd walk by and there was nobody in the hallways, and it's almost eerie in a sense. And I'd walk by and I'd be like, wow, people have to stay here after they have C-sections. And in my mind, I never thought that we would be in there, but I always walked by and I was just like, I feel bad for people in those rooms. Sure enough, we ended up in those rooms. So it's just interesting how that
foreshadow.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's who ends up in those rooms.
Yeah. So we're in the recovery room at this point, and something started happening with him, because this is very blurry for me, so you're going to remember better than I will. Something was wrong with him.
With Hudson.
Yes. And what were they trying to do?
No, they were just taking his measurements, checking his heart rate. But the second they laid him down on the heat table, he started kind of having little jitters, and jitters means low blood sugar.
Well, also with didn't he have something in his throat, and that's when Abby came in?
Yeah. So the second they gave him to me in the OR room, I noticed his breathing. It sounded like he had something in his lungs almost, or his throat. And the whole time, so I was worried. I asked the nurse, is this okay? She's like, oh, that's totally fine. So by the time we got to the PACU, I had called our midwife because I wanted her to come in and make sure she was there while they checked the baby and everything. And I wasn't in the room, so I don't know what she did, but
I think they were a little worried about his lungs and everything. And our midwife came in to just, help me and help the baby and just make sure everything was okay. And all she did was literally just stick her finger in his mouth just so he could swallow whatever,
That's right. She stuck her finger and just had him swallow.
And that was it. And
they went to oh my gosh, we got to check his lungs and do all these
tests. They wanted to go off of all these things. And Abby was just I'm just going to stick my finger in his mouth and he'll swallow whatever is stuck, and that's it. So, that happened, and we were trying to get the baby to latch. Him and I are doing skin to skin and all of these things. And then
beautiful moment, by the way.
Yes, of course. At this point, it's we're done with it. We're just so happy that he's here, and he's healthy and everything's good. And so then we go into our postpartum room, wheel us over to the postpartum room. And at this point, I start kind of going downhill a little bit. I remember being in the room. It's very blurry, but I remember being in the room and I'm profusely sweating. That room felt like it was 90 degrees in there. And I start getting very nauseous. And I can't see straight, and there's 5 nurses in there, and it was just overwhelming for me. And I remember calling my midwife. It's probably 2 a.m. at this point, calling my midwife and my doula. I'm I'm not feeling well, and no one was helping me. And Jason was was my wife okay? She's I'm throwing up at this point. We're trying to get the baby to latch so he can, get some colostrum, all of the things. And I was just not okay. And things started going downhill a little bit. Also, with him, he was getting jittery, which means that he has a low blood sugar. So, what were they having you do?
So they had me every hour take him into the nursery, they call it, where it's basically like a mini NICU where they take care of your baby if something's wrong, but not quite the NICU. You can still go in there and be with your baby. And so I had to go in there every hour. He had to get his heel pricked and checked for low blood sugar. And then I'd have to go back to the room and I'd have to feed him in order to get his blood sugar up. And
Feed him with formula, right? At this point,
so they didn't introduce formula until maybe the third try, so like the third hour in.
you
But
were trying to give him colostrum,
I'm
right?
supposed to come in, put him on your breast, give him colostrum.
Well, I'm throwing up and so nauseous at this point.
Yeah, so we'd spend the first half hour, 45 minutes taking care of Michelle, trying to just get her to hold her boob in his mouth. And then by, 10 minutes left, we'd have to throw some formula in his mouth and I would go and get his heel pricked. His blood sugar would be low. We'd have to do it again. And this happened for 8 hours, I would say, until about 10 a.m. So I hadn't slept for 3 days at this point, and every hour trying to feed a baby who I've never fed a baby before. I have no clue what I'm doing. No one's really helping me. She can barely hold herself up. So that was the next 10 hours.
Wow. But what about you, Michelle, going downhill? Like, did we figure out what was going on? Why
No,
you're feeling so rotten?
no.
We called the head nurse in because they were sending other nurses in that really didn't know anything. So we called the head nurse, and she came in and finally offered her some nausea medication. And I think that probably kicked in eventually after like a couple hours, right?
Oh, I don't even remember getting that, to be honest.
You got some nausea medication. But you were still throwing up this whole entire time. You threw up for 10 hours.
I think it wasn't until the morning time, around like 8 o'clock in the morning, that I kind of finally came to, and I was feeling better and I stopped throwing up. And I was able to drink water. I remember every time I would drink water, it just would come right up. So by this point, his blood sugar isn't getting better.
And the baby was crying and I had to take care of him, and you were laying in the bed, the feeling that you said.
I don't even remember.
You told me a few times.
What did I say?
How you didn't even want to take care of him.
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously I was so out of it, and I remember him, like little glimpses of him in the middle of the night feeding him and taking care of the baby, and I just couldn't be a mom in that moment. I couldn't bond with my baby just because I'm sure all the drugs I was on and how I was feeling, and just, yeah, that was hard, not being able to bond with my baby after birth like I had envisioned. But yeah, so at this point it's the morning and they're starting to talk about bringing him into the NICU. And I remember being in communication with my midwife because I trust her and I wanted her to help us with these decisions. And Jason and I were a little reluctant because we just felt like he was just stressed from the birth. That was a lot for the baby. And, there was just a lot going on and a little overwhelming. You have all these nurses and doctors telling you all these things that's potentially wrong with your baby. And it was definitely overwhelming, and we're lack of sleep. So eventually, after they do all these tests on his brain and, all of these things and trying to figure out what's wrong with him. And our pediatrician actually came to the hospital and she was amazing. And, we're trying to help him and figure out what's wrong with him. And he ends up being, brought into the NICU, which was really hard for us after everything we just went through. Now our baby's going into the NICU, and going back a little bit, when he was still in the nursery before he went into the NICU, and they're doing all these tests, and they wouldn't bring me up to the nursery. And I remember calling and texting Jason, like, they need to bring me up there. At this point, I'm feeling better. I'm like, I'm ready to be a mom. And I'm like, I need to be with my baby. Like, whatever's going on, like, I need to be a part of this. I'm in my postpartum room by myself. And I'm like, send a nurse down here to bring me up. And they're like, we need to get clearance from your doctor. And I'm like, get clearance from my doctor to bring me to my baby up in the nursery, or you're bringing that baby back down to the room with me. So finally they bring me up, and our pediatrician was like, wow, it was just so crazy how the second you walked into the room, Hudson really just just came to and really just brightened up once you came into the room. And we're all like, well, yeah, I'm his mom. Like, of course I'm all he knows for 9 months, and we've been apart for so long at this point. So yeah, he ends up going into the NICU, and he was there for about 5 days. while I was still in the hospital recovering. So I guess a small plus side of me getting a C-section was that I was able to be in the hospital for a little bit longer than if I were to have vaginal, because we could be there while he was just, a floor above us in the NICU. So we would go every 2 hours for his feeding and, spend some time with him in the NICU. And
Oh, so during that time, you're able to breastfeed him?
we were doing breastfeeding, yes, while also doing some formula, which
Okay.
we tried to do donor milk too, and that wasn't helping. And we just needed to get his blood sugar numbers up. And so by the end of it, we were just having him on formula because that's what would get his sugars up. And we were like, we just need to get this baby out of the NICU. And my breast milk or colostrum, whatever it was at that point, and donor milk just wasn't cutting it. So he ended up just doing a little bit of breastfeeding in the beginning of his feedings. And they give you like 30 minutes. So they're like, okay, you got 30 minutes to feed this baby before we, check his blood sugar. So we would do a little bit of breastfeeding just to establish that, finish off with some formula, and then check his sugars. And they would check it every couple hours.
Yeah, no, you'd have a half hour because they'd check his sugars 3 hours later.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have a certain amount of time between the feed and the blood sugar in order for it to be the most impactful. So they only give you a half hour to feed, and then you basically lay there with him, and then they check the sugars 3 hours later.
Oh man.
And he was,
I guess
and
I
he
don't
was
have
on
a little
IV.
newborn continuous glucose monitor
Yeah.
like they have.
Yeah,
I mean, it seems like it would be a great thing for this particular scenario.
totally. Yeah.
He probably had, I don't know, 3 dozen pricks on his heel. His heel looked like he had walked over
Yeah.
an accident.
Poor little baby. But I guess the end of the story is that, he's healthy and, so he was born on a Monday. We got sent home Friday night, which was really hard to leave him, but we got to come back and pick him up Saturday morning and take him home. That was the best day going. I remember driving it back to the hospital to go pick him up and being so emotional because we were able to take him home, and remember coming home and it was just the best day. So yeah, there is a happy ending to this long, long story, and he's healthy and he's doing great and he's a big boy. Every time we take him for a checkup, every nurse is like, wow, that's a big baby. He's nice and healthy, and he'll be 5 weeks tomorrow, and everything is all good.
Oh my gosh. So weirdly, in all my doula births that I've ever been to, I usually am pretty weepy at the end. Big, hairy, weepy guy in the corner. Thankfully, no mascara, or it would always be racetracking down my face. And you just told your story like in such a way that I feel myself tearing up, like I was on the journey with you.
You
And
were
that
on the journey with us.
I was on a lot of it, but just that happy ending just made my heart melt
Thank you.
so profoundly. You guys are great, and I'm sorry for all the struggles that you had. And I'm just grateful that you do have that really beautiful postscript here. But just to recap, so it sounds like from on the health journey on the way out after the baby was out, that he was generally doing okay, but in the operating room having difficulty swallowing until Abby helped him swallow.
Yes.
And then in the
Yeah.
PACU, starting to have some jitters indicating blood sugar issues,
Yeah.
which led to a few days in the NICU until that
Yeah.
settled. But does that mean his APGAR scores were good right when he came out?
They were like 4 points below what they wanted them to be. And then it's like every hour they need to be higher, and they weren't increasing,
Uh-huh.
partly because he wasn't getting food because we were feeding him every hour and he was having trouble breastfeeding. But yeah, I think they were a little low. And I told Abby, and Abby was like, oh my gosh, that's nothing. Just like rub some colostrum on his gums and let him absorb it. So I'm sitting there rubbing his gums, which we probably could have just threw a bottle in his mouth the first time and he probably would have shot up. But that's what
And
we were
then,
doing at first.
Michelle, for you, then the recovery that we talked about in the hospital was your PACU experience was just weirdly full of
Yeah.
nausea, vomiting, weakness, spaciness. It sounds like it took the better part of a day to kind of start to subside until you felt
Yeah.
like yourself again. How did
Yeah.
the recovery from the surgery go? Now you're 5 weeks out.
I think it's crazy that they just throw around C-sections like they're nothing, because it's an intense recovery. Like I remember being in the hospital for that week and I couldn't sit up. Like he had to help me get out of the hospital bed. I'm in and out of a wheelchair, and that was very hard because obviously we had to go visit our baby. And so I had no other option. And it's a very intense recovery. And 5 weeks later, it's still hard for me to go for a couple block walk. And I definitely still feel like I got a major recovery. And everyone's different. Some people recover quickly, but it's been a hard, recovery for sure.
I think
Um,
observationally, two things may have gotten you because you are more fit, healthy, and in tune with your body. One is that feeling of numbness and disconnect from your body with the epidural seems to
mhm,
affect more active people in a more profound way. And
interesting.
then also the recovery from the cesarean because you're so used to your body, just being able to do and go and pushing it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
now, like, to have to caution your walks, just a regular walk around the neighborhood is probably a startling contrast for you.
totally. Yeah, it's hard mentally. I'm like, I want to go for a walk with him and our dogs, but I know that that time will come. I do want to add though, and you and I had talked about this. My OB told me afterwards that the reason why we think that he was breech and he wouldn't progress and all of those things was because I have a heart-shaped uterus.
Ah, okay. First of all,
So,
you read my mind because that was going to be one of my last two questions. Uh-huh. So the heart-shaped uterus, understandably, those babies stay in the Frank breech position. A heart-shaped uterus, meaning at the top it's not rounded, but there's a divot that comes down in the middle, a little septum that can be little or big, actually. And the head will be on one side of that septum, the legs will be on the other side, and it's very hard for them to turn because neither
mhm.
one can get past it. I'm not sure why that would cause the decelerations or why the baby couldn't come down.
Maybe I just made that up. Maybe he
Oh,
didn't say
okay.
that.
Okay. But also that stargaze where their head is back. I mean, you
Uh-huh.
didn't even get to this point, but sometimes the caution about the birth when that baby's stuck in that position because the head can get stuck on the
Mm,
pubic bone on the way out. So
yeah.
I don't know. Oftentimes they know that the best way for them to come out is going to be that abdominal birth and they make it happen. So well, I guess my last question was now that you have all the information that you have,
Mhm.
right? And maybe it's too soon and maybe you don't know, but are there things looking back that you would have wanted to do differently?
No, no, because I feel like we did everything. Even like, I'm glad we tried to do the ECV, when we tried to turn him. I'm glad we tried to do that because I probably still would have wondered, what if we tried that? Would it have worked? And I would have gotten the home birth. So looking back, we did everything that we could. And this was
Even those
how,
horrible chiropractic visits.
I mean, though, that was the best part.
Oh, maybe did you one favor.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly. But, Dr. Brock, our OB, he's like, you can have 4 more vaginals after this. So I will definitely try for a VBAC after this, and there'll be a little bit more room in there. So maybe I'll get that vaginal birth that I'm hoping for one day.
I certainly hope so. And yeah, he can't retire.
And that's what I thought. I was like, I gotta get that second baby before he retires.
Yeah, come on, we're already 5 weeks out.
Yeah, a couple more years, hopefully.
You guys are amazing. I appreciate you so much for coming and sharing your story just as it was and inspiring. I'm inspired by you both and your strength and your resilience and your ability to change course as hard as it was multiple times. And the strength that it sometimes, when all of your instincts are saying, no, I don't want to do this, to do it because you know that that's what's necessary for the baby and for the healthy outcome that you got. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you for having us and allowing me to share my story from beginning to end.
I'm honored to do it. And our audience is, I'm sure at this point, weepy like me. Thanks again for sharing. And at home, thanks for listening to the Informed Pregnancy podcast. For more pregnancy and parenting information just like this, visit us online at informedpregnancy.com.